Welcome back to yet another episode of the Paleontology Fringe Theories Iceberg. I know I say it all the time and you're probably annoyed at me for saying it so many times, but thank you guys so much for your patience, especially for this episode. This is the most popular series on my channel, so it's always in high demand, but these episodes take a long time to research and write and edit. It's just a lot of work, especially with what's been going on these last couple of months. I've already explained it and some of you don't really care anyway, so all I'll say is that some unexpected things happened in regards to school and my living situation. For the most part, it's all been resolved by now, but it's resulted in this episode being delayed because technically it was supposed to be out like a month or so ago. But yeah, that didn't really work out. So just to refresh your memories, in the last episode we finally finished Tier 3 and now we're on Tier 4. And you know what that means. It means we've got a lot of weird shit to cover. I'm excited, I'm sure you're excited, and I'm not going to keep you guys waiting. We're just going to jump right into this. Let's take a look at the first part of Tier 4. Permanent darkness in prehistoric times. Thomas Hawkins was a geologist and fossil collector during the 1800s, and he seemed like a rather eccentric person that had a pretty interesting outlook on how the world was like in prehistoric times. There's not a whole lot on this topic, at least available on the internet, but based on what I have found, Hawkins thought that the world would have been in a permanent state of darkness that was crawling with monstrous creatures alien to our modern world. According to one site, they quote one statement of his that says, "Pursuing with science, matter subjected to supernal light through its early mechanical and organized, hence coupling supernal light, excessive heat, and the atmospherical consequences of both together, it is not too much to say nor for philosophy to concede that the light of the sun, if it existed then at all, which is doubtful, could not penetrate that atmosphere nor subdue that other light, and that it had no conceivable use upon our planet before those creatures were brought forth, to whom alone it could be of any the least value, and without which indeed they could not live." Alright, to dumb this down for anyone who was dropped on their head one too many times as a kid, like myself, Hawkins didn't believe that sunlight was even a thing back then, and even if it was, it wouldn't have been able to break through the smog-filled atmosphere, meaning the planet was in this constant state of darkness. And along with this, even if the sun did exist back then, it wouldn't have any use to the creatures living at that point in time, because again, he believed that the world was in this state of permanent darkness. While there doesn't seem to be much on how people reacted to this idea, what can be said about this is that Hawkins was at least tolerated, in general of course, because of his impressive fossil collection. At least it was impressive until further inspection, as a lot of the collection consisted of plaster that filled in certain parts of the fossils that were incomplete. One account even says that Hawkins apparently scammed a museum by selling them fossils, of which many of them were mainly plaster reconstructions of. Man, that must have really sucked for the museum. One minute you think you're getting a motherload of fossil pieces, the next you find out that you have enough plaster to redo your whole damn museum with. The point that I'm trying to make with this whole thing is that I can't imagine this was any better for his reputation. Like, if he was only tolerated because of his fossil collection, I think that just says a lot about the kind of person he was. And to even go as far as to scam people with his collection, that has to hurt his reputation even more. Of course, I shouldn't base his whole character on this specifically, but I can imagine this didn't help in people trusting or taking his ideas seriously during that point in time. Permian extinction caused by spiral arm. There are many theories and suggestions that posit the idea that mass extinctions here on Earth are not as random as we think. The sun is said to take around 220 to 250 million years to make its full journey around our galaxy. And during this journey, the sun crosses paths with its spiral arms, which are basically elongated regions of stars that are a part of a greater shape that makes up the center of the galaxy. This shape is in the form of a spiral, and the sun passes through the arms of this spiral as it's orbiting the galaxy. And because these arms contain more stars and gas, it has a high density, so every time the sun goes through it, it causes a gravitational disturbance that may contribute to causing comets from the Oort cloud to go out of orbit and sending them down a path that eventually leads to Earth. Now, with all of this in mind, it's led some to think that maybe this event can be linked to the Permian extinction in some way. When you look at the time frame between the Permian extinction event and the Cretaceous extinction event, it could be argued that that entire period of time between those two events were in between two spiral arms. Pterosaurs could not walk. So we all know that pterosaurs can't just be flying 24/7. Obviously, they're going to need to land and move around on the ground at some point, even if their movement here is minimal. The most commonly accepted idea is that pterosaurs could just walk on all fours and get around like that. However, other people had a different idea, that being the possibility that maybe pterosaurs couldn't necessarily walk, so it had to resort to other alternatives for terrestrial locomotion. And while this entry is referring to one specific idea, there were others that suggested that rather than walking, or at least walking on all fours, some pterosaurs maybe crawled, walked bipedally, maybe even waddled, which is definitely a funny thought, just a pterosaur waddling like a penguin. But the specific case for this entry is from C.D. Bromwell and G.R. Whitfield, who together did a 1974 paper on the biomechanics on the pteranodon to presumably use as an example to understand how the flight and movement of pterosaurs worked as a whole. During this paper, they talked about several aspects in regards to the maneuverability of the pterosaur, like how fast it flew, how it glided, how it landed, and how it would take off, among other things. They also mentioned that after the pteranodon would eventually land, it could not stand nor walk, so they would typically land near cliff edges. I don't know if that was a common belief back then, or if this was just a hypothetical, but regardless, they provided that the pterosaurs would use a different method to take off. I'll let the paper explain. It says, the mode of life is considered, showing that pteranodon probably lived on sea cliffs facing the prevailing wind. After landing on the top, it would scrabble forward, it could neither stand up nor walk, and hang from its hind feet over the edge. From here, it could easily launch itself. Manatees are human subspecies. So a couple tiers ago, I mentioned the aquatic ape hypothesis. I forgot if I had mentioned Elaine Morgan and her book titled The Descent of Women or not when I did talk about the hypothesis. But if you guys are familiar with the community surrounding anthropological evolution, then chances are you know who she is. But for those of you that don't, she was a television screenwriter for the BBC, but also dabbled in certain concepts revolving around human evolution. However, some of her ideas were not always approached scientifically, mainly because Morgan didn't really have any kind of real academic training in regards to human evolution, of course aside from reading about it on her own time, which she did much of, but it was also because these approaches came from a place of annoyance at the fact that most books talking about evolution were often coming from the perspective of just, or mainly just, men, and not very much from women. Along with this, she was also a known supporter of the aquatic ape hypothesis, which plays an important role for this entry. So with all of this in mind, it would result in the 1972 book titled The Descent of Women, which is supposed to be a bit of a jab towards Charles Darwin's book on evolution titled The Descent of Man. The contents of this book are very interesting, and I haven't even read it the whole way through. I won't lie, I skimmed a lot of it, not because I don't take her views seriously, even though it didn't get the best reception when it came out, but mainly because I wanted to find the segment of this book that this specific entry was referencing. And based on what I found, it seems that Morgan hints at the possibility that human ancestors that were still living the arboreal lifestyle that they were known to have before transitioning to land may have faced an ecological crisis that forced them into the waters. As a result, it's possible that they would evolve into a mammalian aquatic group known today as the Sirenians, of which manatees are a part of. I think you guys get what I'm trying to say here. One of the reasons why she suspected this was because she was making parallels to the physical similarities between humans and manatees, mainly in the pectoral region. Some of her evidence includes that the Sirenians are the only mammalian group to have pneumatically breastfeeding females, they have a single pair of breasts, give birth to single pups at a time. By the way, if you're having a bad day, here's a picture of a manatee baby. She even tries to associate the jointed flippers of a manatee as once being the hands of our primate ancestors that were developed to suit a more marine lifestyle.
Now, the aquatic ape hypothesis is considered to be a controversial topic that's not accepted by the majority of the scientific community, but I don't want this entry to be just about the general idea of the aquatic ape hypothesis. The reason why I bring it up though is because people hear this specific idea and immediately disregard it because of its association with the hypothesis, showing the kind of reputation it has in this community. Admittedly, there do seem to be some similarities between humans and manatees, but manatees are animals that already have been shown to have an evolutionary history that don't directly involve humans. In fact, the closest relative to the manatees is said to be elephants, and their ancestors are large land-dwelling grass-eating mammals that originated millions of years ago. Birds evolved from stem hematotherm. When it comes to birds and mammals, the most common idea is that their groups have been split since way before the dinosaurs ever existed. Some people had different ideas and may have thought that these two groups could be more closely related than we first thought. And this is through an idea that was actually first brought up by Sir Richard Owens. This idea would become known as the hematothermia hypothesis. Basically, the idea went that maybe because of similar endothermic qualities that both mammals and birds have, that indicates that they're more related than we first thought. Not only are both groups warm-blooded animals, but both have 4-chambered hearts. 2 of the chambers being atria and the other 2 being ventricle. I guess the idea didn't really pick up a lot of steam back when it was first brought up, because most of the references made for it come from the more modern depictions of it, more specifically during the late 70s, early 80s. It was popularized by people like Brian Gardiner, Philippe Janvier, and Soren Lovetrup. I don't even know if I pronounced that last one correctly. This series has shown how American I am just by the way I pronounce things. Yeah, sorry about that, my teachers have failed me. I've got the big dumb. Alright, enough with the self-deprecation. Brian Gardiner was a British paleontologist and biologist, Soren Lovetrup was a Danish embryologist, and Philippe Janvier was a French paleontologist. All of these guys contributed to the idea, Janvier especially, even apparently providing art of what the ancestral stem group of mammals and birds would have looked like, and the outcome is definitely something. This obviously amazing and beautiful image depicts a scrawny rodent-like creature with elongated limbs and tail, and is suited to live an arboreal lifestyle. Honestly, this definitely looks like one of those out-of-context vintage paleo art that ends up becoming a meme. Regardless of how it looks, it's still an interesting visual representation of this idea. Fossil creatures in European devil lore. Fossils in folklore isn't a new thing here on the iceberg. Many countries have had their ideas and depictions as to what fossils can be or mean. In regards to Europe, it's commonly known that many associate fossil remains with that of devil lore. One specific example of this that's referenced on the list is a particular illustration that was created by Marcantonio Raimondi, an Italian engraver known for his contributions towards printmaking. He's made many different images using this method, but one that stands out for this iceberg is one that goes by a couple of different names. Sometimes it's referred to as the witch's possession, and other times it's known as the carcass. Actually, one consistent piece of information I could find for this specific piece is that while it's commonly agreed that Raimondi was the one that engraved this image, the original creator for it still remains a mystery. There have been guesses based on the style and design of the image, but nothing seems to have been confirmed from what I've seen. Anyways, part of European devil lore is that fossilized remains are used as instruments and tools by the devil, and in this specific illustration, it shows a witch being pulled on what some sources have called a chariot made from the carcass of some strange, almost otherworldly animal. The chariot is being pulled and pushed by demon-like humans in a bog-like landscape, being accompanied by dark-coated goats. Another source describes this landscape as a dark and menacing underworld that the witch is being pulled through, indicating the devil's association in this image. Gresslyosaurus madness. So this one's definitely an obscure one, and probably one of the more interesting ones I've read so far, especially with how it ends. There's a bit of a story to it, so bear with me here until we get to what this entry is specifically referring to. Also, there was only one real source I was able to find this under, and that was from the Manospondylus blog site, which is actually where I've gotten a lot of my information for some of these entries. This article really did help out. So check out Manospondylus if you like paleontology stuff, they have a lot of that there, and check out this story specifically on their page because obviously I'm only going to be delivering a summarized version of it. Anyways, back to the story. This entry is specifically revolved around Swiss paleontologist named Amans Gressley. Gressley had a passion for geology and spent years building up a rather impressive collection of fossils. Despite his good-natured attitude towards his passions and colleagues, Gressley's life as a scientist had several tragic turns to it, a lot of which were due to his mental health struggles. Gressley would later meet another scientist by the name of Louis Agassiz, a Swiss-American biologist who admired Gressley's fossil collection and even hired him as his assistant as a way to use various parts of this collection for his own works. Agassiz is a pretty respected scientist even to this day, as he has had several important contributions to glacier movements and effects, specifically the kind of effects they had on the Jura Mountains in Switzerland, which contributed a lot to later studies of stratigraphy. During this point in time, Gressley was already Agassiz's assistant, and together the two worked on a book on the matter. Whether it was just the workload put onto him, or his mind succumbing to mental illness, or maybe a little bit of both, but Gressley would unfortunately suffer a mental breakdown, which caused him to stay in a mental institution in Solothurn. How long he would stay here for, I don't really know, but while this was happening, Agassiz was busy working on his next project. Unfortunately, this project would prove to be a bit too much for Agassiz. He wanted to write what was essentially a massive and extended paper on the research of extinct fish, which was another passion of his. But the overall production of this project ended up putting Agassiz in debt, so what did he do? He skipped town, of course. In fact, he skipped the continent and went to America. What's worse is that he also stole several fossils from Gressley's collection. Upon learning about this, Gressley would also leave town to live as a bit of a recluse in the Jura Mountains to do what he had always loved doing, studying rocks. Occasionally, he would revisit certain towns to publish his findings, only to disappear back into the mountains to continue his studies. This went on until about the early 1860s, when life for him seemed to finally look up after he was hired as a geological surveyor for the Swiss Central Railway, and during his time there, his work was noticed and praised by the scientific community. Despite this, things would take a sad and even disturbing turn in Gressley's life. Let's backtrack a little bit with the discovery of the Gresslyosaurus. This dinosaur specifically has had a complicated history that I won't go too deep into here because this entry is already long enough. But basically, this dinosaur went through many different phases of being valid, synonymized with already established prosauropod dinosaurs, therefore making it invalid, only for re-examinations to say otherwise, possibly making it valid again, and so on and so forth. One consistent aspect of this dinosaur though is that it is some type of prosauropod. Whether it is its own type or just a version of an already discovered one seems to still be up in the air. Regardless, it was named after Gressley after he discovered it in 1840, and that seems to be the extent of Gressley's association with it. Until years later in 1864, when he's finally pushed to the edge with his mental health problems. From the sounds of it, this was when Gressley suffered the worst of it, to the point where he was put in an insane asylum and stayed there until his death only a short time later in 1865. He had suffered a stroke. Several years later, in 1876, one of Gressley's friend in the field, Oswald Heer, published a book titled The Primeval World of Switzerland. In this book were some of the documentations of Gressley's final days of life. And from what it says, it shows that Gressley had just completely lost it. He was apparently so far gone mentally that it got to the point where Gressley thought that he himself was turning into the prosauropod dinosaur he had discovered years earlier. According to the site, the book states from Heer's words himself, poor Gressley, who, falling into insanity, had to be brought to the lunatic asylum, was antagonized by the thought that he had transformed into this Gresslyosaurus. It should be noted that Heer personally knew Gressley and likely visited him at the asylum where he might have been able to document this. Gressley is still known and remembered well by Swiss paleontologists. A prize known as the Prize Ammons Gressley is named after him by the Swiss Paleontological Society as a way to honor him. And along with the Gresslyosaurus, another dinosaur, this time a sauropod, was also named after him, being given the name Ammonsia. So despite the hardships during his lifetime, it's nice to see him continue to be praised and honored after it. Iguanodon tongue hole. Iguanodon, like most dinosaurs, has gone through so much change and reconstruction over the course of its known existence to us. In fact, I think Iguanodon has to be one of the dinosaurs that have undergone some of the most drastic changes. Just look at it between the early to mid 1800s to now. But during its history, more specifically in the late 1800s, Belgian paleontologist Louis Dolo spent a lot of his time studying the Iguanodon specifically, which was his method as a paleontologist. During this time, the Bone Wars had been happening, and the major focus with that event was for which involving paleontologists could discover the most fossils and specimens they could put their name behind. With Dolo, he simply wanted to focus solely on the Iguanodon and did so through many years of preparation, articulation, studying, and writing about his findings on several of the Iguanodon specimens discovered in southeast Belgium. Dolo was actually responsible for the retro look of Iguanodon that I'm sure a lot of you are most familiar with. You know, the one with the kangaroo-like stance, spent most of its time near the water as it was most likely amphibious, and of course no one can forget the infamous tongue hole. The Iguanodon tongue hole is an outdated and misrepresented part of the Iguanodon skull, which was an opening in its bottom jaw. It was suggested that maybe this hole indicated that this dinosaur had a prehensile tongue that would exit from the hole to grasp high-ranging vegetation for it to feed on. However, it was later revealed that this tongue hole that the Iguanodon supposedly had for its prehensile tongue was actually just a broken-off piece of bone from the bottom jaw. Of course, this was something that had been documented in books and in paleoart, which shows what this reconstruction may have looked like in the wild. I don't know if it's just me, but I get this weird, uneasy feeling looking at this. Kinda makes me feel a little uncomfortable, maybe because of how different this idea is from my normal view of Iguanodon. Anyways, as far as Dolo's other observations and suggestions regarding Iguanodon's anatomy go, a lot of it ended up being incorrect, but I think people still recognize the work he put into studying what he could about it. Tilliard Psychical Research. English-Australian entomologist Robin Tilliard worked as a researcher studying the biology and phylogeny of various insect groups. The ones that he had done the most research on were things like lacewings, scorpion flies, and dragonflies, and even though he didn't seem to research them as heavily, he also took an interest in griffin flies as well. Looking back on his works, it would be an understatement to say that he had an obvious passion for insects, being further confirmed by the various papers and books he had written about them. And while a lot of his research seems to be focused on the modern lives of insects, his interest would expand to extinct insects as well. For example, he studied and written about insect fossils from the Permian fossil beds of Kansas, he studied the fossil remains of Mesozoic insects, and he's taken great interest in the very large and extinct dragonflies and griffinflies from before the dinosaurs. Not only was he a respected entomologist, but he was also a respected paleoentomologist as well. This passion of insects would eventually blend with another interest of his, which was of the occult. Tilliard would actually visit mediums and psychics not just for his own personal outings, but also to help him in his line of work. In the biographical memoirs of Fellows of the Royal Society, it states, "For a number of years, Tilliard had been greatly interested in psychical matters and took every opportunity that offered for gaining acquaintance with so-called supernormal manifestations evoked through mediums. He was a firm believer in the reality of such phenomena and rightly upheld the necessity for their proper scientific study. In Nature for 18th of August 1928, he brought forward what he believed to be evidence of survival of physical death."
There is another source that references another book titled Evolution of Insects that apparently states, "It is little known that Tilliard was also a devotee of the occult who believed that mysticism could be used to understand the lives of long-vanished organisms. It has even been recounted that he once visited the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University with the idea of having a local Bostonian mystic bring back to life the huge Permian griffinfly specimens preserved there so that he could observe their behavior." So yeah, he would sometimes use what he had learned through these seances into his scientific research, and even apparently attempted to resurrect an extinct insect to learn more about it. But I couldn't tell you how much he did this. From what I've read on him, most of his works involving insects both alive and extinct seem to be well respected and legit. And let me tell you, when it comes to mysticism being blended with scientific works, the outcomes are not always held in high regard. And along with that, whatever seances or psychic practices he did participate in were considered to be nothing more than hoaxes, save for one, which is likely just a coincidence, but one psychic in 1928 predicted that Tilliard would die in a car accident within the following 10 years, to which he would kind of shrug off. In 1937, Tilliard would get into a fatal car accident that would break his neck and cause him to die later at the hospital. I tend to be skeptical over this kind of mysticism, especially when it comes to stuff like this, but what do you guys think? Compsognathus had flippers. Compsognathus coralestris was one of two semi-complete skeletons, this one being located in France and the other being located in Germany, more specifically in Bavaria. From these two finds alone, there were some interesting aspects to their arms specifically that scientists took note of when studying them. Like, for example, how the German specimen didn't have a third finger, leading to some to consider the possibility of a two-fingered Compsognathus, and others to speculate that the absence of the third finger was due to it maybe being a residual or vestigial finger, with the latter being more commonly accepted. This is not what we're talking about though, because another idea that someone had that was a lot more notable was that the Compsognathus may have possessed flippers instead of regular hands and fingers. Scientist Alain Bedard would go on to further study the Compsognathus coralestris. The thing about this French specimen, which was found in 1971, is that it was the second of the two to be discovered. It was also notably bigger than the German specimen and was found near lagoonal deposits from the Jurassic period. Bedard also noticed that the arm and hand bones of the French Compsognathus were stiff, a characteristic uncommonly seen from other dinosaurs like it. This, along with the impressions on the slab that could be associated with skin wrinkles, and the area it was discovered in, would lead him to speculate that the Compsognathus coralestris may have had flippers instead of hands and fingers. It's possible it could have used these flippers to live a semi-aquatic lifestyle and give it a way to propel itself through the lagoons and marshes of the Jurassic period. But then the remains were redescribed by John Ostrom. According to an abstract from a paper written by Karen Payer, a re-examination of the French Compsognathus coralestris from the Portlandian lithographic limestones of the Tithonian of southern France provides new cranial and postcranial information crucial for a better understanding of the taxon Compsognathus. The abstract ends with anatomical and morphological characters of the Bavarian specimen of Compsognathus are nearly identical to those of the French specimen. The differences are related to ontogenetic or within species variation, or are caused by preservational factors. Therefore, this study proposes that C. coralestris is a subjective junior synonym of Compsognathus longips from Bavaria. So Compsognathus coralestris was no longer valid, and along with that, Ostrom also debunked the flipper hypothesis. Bedard had also based the hypothesis on a hypothetical dermal bone that may or may not have been on the Compsognathus forelimb area, but Ostrom made it clear that because this was merely a hypothetical of an incomplete find, nothing can be set in stone, so to speak. So in case it wasn't already obvious enough, I used Edge's video on the same topic as a pretty good reference point for this segment. But of course, this is all just more of a summary of the events. But if you want to know more about this topic, go check Edge's video out in the description below. Who Lies Sleeping? This is referring to a book, the full title being Who Lies Sleeping? The Dinosaur Heritage and the Extinction of Man. This was an obscure and really weird book written by Mike McGee in 1993 that serves as a look into the theory of a pre-existing saurian society ran by dinosaurs called the Anthroposaurus sapiens, of which McGee apparently believed was real. I haven't read the book myself, and at the time that I'm making this video, I have actually ordered it in the hopes of learning more about it. I have always loved the idea of sapient dinosaurs and their biology and lifestyle, despite how bizarre it can end up being. So hearing about this book makes me want to know more about McGee's idea behind this society of intelligent dinosaurs that ended up wiping themselves out and have very little evidence for their existence today. To be completely honest with you guys, I don't even really want to talk about the book anymore because I kind of want to just read it myself and maybe go more in depth with it in a video all on its own. So with all of that said, all I'll say is that based on the different reviews and blogs that I've read about who lies sleeping, the author not only goes through the various evolutionary stages these sapient dinosaurs went through, but also references other works and theories popular in paleontology, things like Robert Backer's book, The Dinosaur Heresies, and Elaine Morgan's aquatic ape hypothesis. I know I'm not giving you much to work with here, and I'm sorry for that, but I kind of just want to experience this book for myself. And it's not like there's much coverage on it anyways, probably because of how obscure it was, so I'll just leave it at that. Dashavatara's evolutionary account. In Hindu religion, there is a god known as Vishnu who is able to reincarnate into one of 10 avatars, which together are called the Dashavataras. According to Indian literature, the order that the avatars are labeled as goes as followed. Matsya as a half-fish, half-human avatar, Kurma as a half-tortoise, half-human avatar, Varaha as a half-boar, half-human avatar, Narsima as a half-lion, half-human avatar, Vamana as a dwarf Brahmin avatar, Parashurama as a Brahmin warrior avatar, Rama as the deity of morality and rules avatar, Krishna as the god of compassion and protection avatar, Buddha as the teacher and founder of Buddhism avatar, and finally, Kalki is a warrior avatar that's often depicted with a large sword and riding a white horse. As deep as their meaning and stories are, some have interpreted these avatars to have more scientific meanings behind them, mainly regarding evolution. One account of this was made by J.B.S. Haldane, a British Indian scientist who worked in many fields, one of them being evolutionary biology. He saw these avatars as a rough idea of vertebrate evolution, as the beginning of the chain of avatars begins with a deity that represents a simple life form of aquatic organisms. Then the line progressively moves up to more advanced animals until it reaches to Vamana, who might be seen as part of a man. Get it? Because he's a dwarf. Was that too fucked up? Was that too tasteless? You know what? Fuck it. I'm leaving it in. That was funny. Anyway, some of the early human and human-like stages of these avatars can be interpreted as early hominids before becoming fully advanced humans. And as if these weren't enough to be seen as parallel to evolution, the Dashavataras also have a time cycle as well, known as the Yuga cycle. And these different incarnations took place at different points during this cycle. From the Matsya avatar through the Narasimha avatar was the Satya Yuga. From the Vamana avatar to the Rama avatar was the Treta Yuga. The Krishna and Buddha avatars occurred during the Vapara Yuga. And finally, only Kalki occurred during the Kali Yuga. Hopefully I pronounced all of that right, because that was kind of a mouthful. I don't think I did. I apologize if I didn't. It's possible that people could interpret this cycle as eras in evolutionary history as well, but like all things, not everyone agrees with this idea. Some think that the Dashavataras only have their traditional stories that avoid any instance of biological theories. Paleodictyon. The Paleodictyon are fossilized hexagonal prints made in a net-like pattern. While the honeycomb design is interesting in the context of fossilized remains, the mystery lies in what causes it. In fact, scientists can't seem to tell if this is the remnants of biological activities caused by an organism, or if this is the organism itself. What is known about it is that finds have ranged all the way back to the Precambrian era, but have also been found in marine deposits that date back to the Mesozoic and even Cenozoic era. And things get even weirder from here, because the range of these specimens is so broad that there are even modern specimens of these things that can be located on the deep sea floors today. And if you're just seeing a picture of nothing but holes, those are actually tiny nozzles protruding from the overall shape of the Paleodictyon, of which the rest is hidden under the sand. What's strange is that the modern specimens have these nozzles, but they are completely absent from the fossilized ones. But going back to the Dictyon as a whole, there are just several questions that scientists have yet to answer. Are these things biotic or abiotic? If they're abiotic, are they trace fossils caused by a living organism? And if they are, then what could these shapes mean? Some have speculated that the way it's structured could be used as a trap for food or burrows for smaller organisms. But then there's questions like, how did smaller organisms manage to burrow or make marks as precise as these? And if it was caused by a living organism and we're still seeing them today, then where and what are they? At one point, some suggested that these patterns were deep sea organisms like sponges, coral, or algae. But looking into these modern specimens, scientists learned through attempting to collect DNA evidence from them that they don't actually have any living thing living within them. And of the DNA material they did manage to collect from it, it was protist DNA, which was found on the exterior of the prints and nothing that was from any of the possible living organisms listed earlier. This is definitely an interesting topic, and I suggest watching PBS Eon's video about the Paleodictyon to learn more about it. Their video was a pretty big help in researching it, and admittedly, I did use a lot of the information they said there for this segment of the iceberg. But they definitely have a lot more to say about it, so if you want to know more, I'll leave their video in the description below. PETM caused by pre-human civilization. There was a point in time 56 million years ago that was pinpointed by paleoceanographers in the early 90s, which was detected from isotope records from marine sediments that's been dated back as far as the end of the Paleocene epoch. This point in time is known as the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, or PETM for short, and it represented a specific point in which the world faced what was essentially a spike in global warming, which lasted for about 100,000 years. What caused this unexpected surge of heat is not actually known for sure. But what scientists have found out is that 13C depleted carbon is associated with this global warming event, which some believe to be caused by methane hydrants released from volcanic eruptions. This event has also led others to support another idea that we also already talked about in a previous tier, the Silurian hypothesis, which was a thought experiment to see whether or not modern sciences could possibly find any evidence of a pre-human civilization that existed millions of years ago. While this is just a hypothesis, some people have taken the idea pretty seriously in some cases, and even used things like PETM as evidence for the possible existence of an advanced civilization that predated our own. An event like this that shows a lot of fossil carbons being used could indicate that this pre-human civilization were advanced enough to live a more industrial lifestyle, leading to the spike that we know as PETM today. But that idea was kind of thrown out the window due to the time frame differences between the increase of carbon back then and the increase of it now. As mentioned earlier, the PETM, or the heightened amount of carbon in the air, took around 100,000 years to unravel, whereas for us today, it only took a few hundred years. So this has led scientists to suspect more naturalistic causes. Kircher's fossil studies. Athanasius Kircher was a German Jesuit priest and scholar who researched in many different fields including mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and so on. He had a lot of curiosity and wonder about the world around him, and he sought to study it, sometimes in rather unconventional ways. One of the better examples of this was when he had quite literally lowered himself into the crater of Mount Vesuvius, a volcano that, at the time, had erupted not too long before he did this. The reason why he descended into the volcano shortly after its eruption was because he wanted to take a closer look at the features within the mountain after experiencing violent activity like that. As interesting as this guy is, what this entry is really focused on is his study with fossils, another thing that sparked his interest. However, Kircher was living in a time when fossils were not very well understood and had more of a general meaning to it than it being specifically associated to the remains of prehistoric life. As a result, Kircher would come up with different hypotheses to explain their origins. Some of the guesses he made were correct in that some of these remains belonged to animals in the past, because at the time a lot of other people suspected that they may have belonged to giants, especially with the discovery of much larger bones, but Kircher rejected this idea as he wasn't really on board with the belief of giants at all. Another idea he had for fossil origins actually involved a more alchemical method, which he called lipidifying juices. While he was able to pretty much nail the fact that fossils belong to living organisms, especially living organisms of the past, how they would form is a much different story. Kircher believed that fossils formed through a process caused by a solution mixed with several different elements, described as a spirituous seleno-sulfuro-mercurial vapor created by God himself. This vapor or solution, which is what Kircher referred to as lipidifying juice, is what turns things into stone upon physical contact. If this topic sounds somewhat familiar, it's because we covered a similar concept from another entry in a previous tier, more specifically Aristotle's petrification fluid, which essentially had the same effect of turning organic things into stones. Noogenesis. This entry is an association, yet again, to another entry that we talked about in a previous tier, which was the omega point. If you don't know what the omega point is, I'll give you a quick rundown. Jesuit priest and paleontologist Teilhard Chardin suggested that the evolution of our universe is progressing towards a greater end goal, more specifically to unify in a metaphysical being that's referred to as the omega point. The progression has been occurring in stages, and the noosphere is said to be the third or fourth stage of a total of 5. First, there's geogenesis, the beginning of Earth, then there's biogenesis, the beginning of life, then anthropogenesis, which is the beginning of humanity, followed by noogenesis, which is the beginning of mind or consciousness, finally ending with Christogenesis, the beginning of divine powers. Dark matter killed the dinosaurs. To add even more to the mass extinction events caused at certain intervals list, some scientists have suggested that maybe dark matter is the reason for these extinctions, like the one that killed the dinosaurs. Dark matter is an extensive mystery on its own, because scientists don't even really know what dark matter is, especially since it's not a very easy thing to detect. It's not visible, it doesn't interact with the electromagnetic field, it is unable to emit or reflect or even absorb light. The only way scientists have been able to detect it is through the gravitational effects it has on normal matter. So dark matter can be best described as a hypothetical substance similar to regular matter that makes up a large portion of the universe but is still shrouded in mystery. But because it has this gravitational effect on things, some think that clouds of dark matter within the galaxy could potentially change the course of passing comets towards Earth, causing the mass extinction events that we know today. To give you an idea of how much dark matter takes up from the galaxy, one article says this: researchers estimate that in the plane of the galaxy, each square light year contains about 1 solar mass of dark matter. And that's not all. Along with this, in the same article, it suggests that dark matter could have more of a direct effect on Earth as well. As the solar system passes through this purported haze of particles clogging the galactic plane, some get trapped by Earth's gravity. These particles orbit Earth's core and eventually fall into the center of the planet, where they interact with normal matter or one another, releasing energy that gets transformed into heat. And to be more specific, this was actually suggested by geologist Michael Rampino, who continues to say that dark matter could continue to raise the heat temperature of the Earth's core by hundreds of degrees, which could then be carried to Earth's surface, causing global scale impacts that could destroy land masses, wipe out entire species, and create an overall inhospitable landscape. Extraterrestrial virus cause evolution. So I briefly mentioned this when I talked about Fred Hoyle's book on the fake Archaeopteryx in a previous tier, but one notable thing about Hoyle is that he didn't believe in the conventional idea of evolution through natural selection. In fact, he didn't even really believe that life started here on Earth. but rather he believed that life started on a comet that may have contained some organic material that crashed into the formerly lifeless ball of rock that Earth was billions of years ago. Of course, that's different from what we're talking about here now, but the idea that this specific entry is referring to does contribute to this belief of his. Anyways, what this entry is trying to say is that evolution is instead caused by viruses from outer space that merge with the DNA of the organisms here on Earth and cause mutations that change their physical forms. Hoyle actually has a few books on this idea, one of which is quite literally called Evolution from Space, a Theory of Cosmic Creation. I won't lie, this idea really fascinates me, and I may try to find a copy of this book to read further into Hoyle's idea. Who knows, maybe I'll make it into a whole video as well, we'll see. The Pneumolosphere. Randolph Kirkpatrick was a British scientist that focused a lot of his studies on sponges, Cnidaria, and Bryozoa groups. I think I pronounced that last one correctly. Despite him spending a lot of his life on these topics, he's mainly known for his 1913 book that he wrote containing strange but fascinating ideas on the history of life and the structure of Earth. This book was titled The Pneumolosphere, an account of the organic origin of so-called igneous rocks and abyssal red clays. Yeah, that's its entire title, right there, that whole thing. Anyways, this book proposed that the world used to be a landless place, only occupied by oceans. That is, until another layer of Earth's crust began to grow over a span of millions of years. And this is when things get a little weird, because Kirkpatrick believes that this whole other layer of Earth's crust was made up of pneumolites. Another thing that Kirkpatrick has spent a lot of time studying were pneumolites, which in this case are referring to the fossilized shells of an ancient protozoan that belonged to the Foraminifera group of single-celled organisms, and they're known for their coil patterns. Kirkpatrick studied limestone and other rock materials and noticed that all of them had contained these pneumolite shells. What's weirder is that he even found them in rocks that were apparently unable to contain fossils due to specific conditions that would keep them from being able to preserve them. So, in his book, Kirkpatrick mentions that all rocks, literally all rocks in the world, are made up of pneumolite shells that have been accumulated over the span of millions of years, and even refers to the Earth as the Pneumolosphere due to the amount of buildup there was from the pneumolites, to the point where it essentially created another layer of Earth that contains the land masses and rock formations we see today. Dinosaur extinction caused by overactive pituitary glands. Baron Franz Nopcsa was many things, one of which a paleontologist. He had a few different theories for what caused the extinction of dinosaurs, but the one that was most peculiar was the possibility of dinosaurs having overactive pituitary glands. This gland is located at the bottom of our brains, and it's actually pretty small. However, its main function is using hormones to regulate and monitor the growth and development of many bodily functions and the size of the living organism. Sometimes, though, pituitary glands become overactive, causing what is called hyperpituitarism, which releases an excessive amount of hormones in your bloodstream that can affect many bodily functions like reproduction, metabolism, and growth. Nopcsa suggested that dinosaurs may have had overactive pituitary glands, causing them to be excessively overgrown to the point of developing pathological issues in regards to their size, being unable to carry their own weight, and being unable to adapt, causing their inevitable extinction. Witness of the Deluge. During the early 1700s, Swiss physician and naturalist, oh boy, I'm gonna butcher this one, Johann Jakob Schweitzer, I think is how you pronounce that, based on the pronunciations that I've looked up here on the internet. This is what the internet's telling me. I could be wrong, please don't harass me in the comments. Anyways, Schweitzer had a great interest in fossils and their origins. Apparently, he was convinced that the most plausible way for fossils to form was by the biblical flood, and sought to find more evidence for it. And he would. In 1726, Schweitzer would eventually come across the fossilized remains of a man that he believed was swept away and perished from the global flood. He named the specimen Homo deluvi testis, which meant man, witness of the deluge. He would publish his findings, but of course was met with some criticism, with other people thinking that he may have just found fossils of some kind of other ancient animal rather than a man. But even to his death in 1733, Schweitzer believed that his discovery was the remnants of a human victim to the biblical flood, therefore proving irrefutable truth that it actually happened. After Schweitzer's death, the remains were taken to the Netherlands and placed inside the Taylor's Museum in Haarlem. Then in 1811, Georges Cuvier decided to take a closer look at the specimen, even going as far as uncovering it from the surrounding rocks. What he had found was, in fact, not the fossilized remains of a human, but rather the fossilized remains of a large salamander dated back 13 million years ago to the Miocene epoch. This prehistoric salamander would no longer go by the name of Homo deluvitestis, and was given the replacement name of Andreas schweitzeri, in honor or mockery of its founder. Godzillus. In 2011, a large and strange fossil was discovered in Cincinnati by amateur paleontologist Ron Fine, who is actually a part of a whole group of amateur paleontologists called the Dry Dredgers. During the span of a whole summer, Fine made 12 trips to fully excavate this almost 7-foot-long specimen, which was made up of flat-looking bones of some type that have a strange groove and almost scaly-like texture to them. It would eventually be given the name Godzillus, most likely due to its large size. Who these bones belong to is a bit of a mystery, but Fine is confident that it's biological and also mentioned that it dates back to 450 million years ago in the Ordovician. Fine guessed that it belonged to a marine plant of some kind that stood upright and had branches, which could have made its size even taller, but this speculated posture may not be completely accurate. After they studied the fossils more, they noticed that trilobite remains were located on the underside of the Godzillus. It's mentioned that trilobite specimens are sometimes found like this on the remains of other specimens because they're attempting to seek shelter. But aside from this, nothing else is really known about the Godzillus, especially since it's such a unique find. Nothing like it has been found and or recorded in the fossil records. It's not even 100% certain whether it's a plant or an animal. But scientists have given out some guesses. Some think it was a rare example of a large soft-body organism. Others think it could be a fossilized mat of algae or even bacteria clumped together in dirt and debris, and so on. Whatever it is, it's definitely a weird find. Earth periodically restocks extinct species. This entry is making reference to the strange occurrence of thought-to-be extinct animals making unexpected comebacks in modern times. And while this is definitely an interesting topic to dissect, by the way it's put here on the iceberg, I think more likely than not this is supposed to be more of a jokey kind of entry. Not necessarily because a topic in itself is a joke, but mainly because the theory might be seen as one. You'll see what I mean here in a second. And another reason why this is because the people who are referenced, named John Mitchell and Robert Ricard, wrote a somewhat satirical book about this exact topic called Living Wonders, Mysteries and Curiosities of the Animal World. And in this book, they list off several examples of extinct animal and plant species making a modern reappearance. Some examples of these organisms that were thought to be extinct include some pretty well-known examples like the coelacanth and the okapi, but they also talk about things like the Don redwood trees, also known as the metasequoia, that once thrived in China about 100 million years ago according to its fossil records. And more recently, in 1946, a handful of these trees were discovered growing in the Yangtze Valley, and within the next couple of years, even more were found, totaling to about 1,000 different ones. Another example were the Australian pygmy possums that were thought to have been extinct for about 20,000 years, but a handful of them turned up in the mid-1960s. Then there was the Discus maclintocki snail that was thought to have been extinct since the Pleistocene epoch, but made an appearance as a colony in 1978 inside a cave in Iowa. Next is the Bermuda petrel, a species of bird that was thought to have been wiped out by the 1620s, only for it to turn up in the 1950s. I think you get the idea. They continue this segment by giving a little more detail behind their theory and calling it the theory of revival. In this part, they go more in depth to explain the support behind this idea of reoccurring species that were once thought to be extinct. They do this by referencing other works and figures that also support this idea, and then they give their own ideas for it. But according to this book, the most formidable support came from a 1981 book titled A New Science of Life, written by biologist Rupert Sheldrake, who says, "Time after time when atoms come into existence, electrons fill the same orbitals around the nuclei. Atoms repeatedly combine to give the same molecular forms. Again and again, molecules crystallize into the same spatial patterns. Seeds of given species give rise year after year to plants of the same appearance. Generation after generation, spiders spin the same types of web. Forms come into being repeatedly, and each time each form is more or less the same." And Mitchell and Ricard continued by saying, "According to Sheldrake's hypothesis, the reoccurrence of similar forms in nature, as well as the phenomenon of instinctive behavior, are caused by resonance from morphological and behavioral patterns in the past. Nature, in other words, is programmed to repeat itself." Biopiraptor McLaughlini. Paleo artist and author John McLaughlin has some pretty interesting ideas when it came to dinosaurs. I think I've mentioned him once or twice here on the Iceberg already, but no way those entries can be as weird as his hypothetical sapient dinosaur that he calls the Biopiraptor. Actually, he wasn't even the one that called it that. He created it, but he didn't call it that. We'll get to that though. This anthropomorphic dinosaur first showed up in a 1984 article from the Animal Kingdom magazine, which was a product of a unique crisis that McLaughlin was going through that he called evolutionary bioparanoia, which is something that he came up with himself. Basically, he started to do some pretty heavy thinking in regards to the lifespan of technologically advanced societies, and how far future geologists, who would presumably be non-human, would look back on our remains of our society after our self-caused extinction through nuclear wars and whatnot. You know, the normal stuff you'd think about on your average Tuesday afternoon. I actually don't have a way to reference back to the paper directly since I couldn't really find it. I'm actually only working with an archived blog post by Darren Naish, which I'll have linked in the description below so you can take a better look at this post yourself. Anyways, continuing with the post, McLaughlin begins to think about an alternative timeline where dinosaurs were as successful as humans, concluding that it would be the dromaeosaur dinosaurs that would work best for this hypothetical considering their intelligence. What's born from this thought is a sapient dinosaur with human-like features and intelligence, having an enlarged cranium, thumbs, and a slight but noticeable upright posture, along with wearing accessories and holding a tool of some kind. And like I said earlier, McLaughlin didn't give his creation any sort of name, scientific or otherwise. And it's actually Naish that's credited for coming up with the name Biopiraptor McLaughlini for this now infamous creature within the paleo community. Alright, let's end it there. Wow, this was this was definitely a longer video than the normal ones we've covered so far. I also want to just note real quick that we are literally just under halfway through this tier. So that means we're not even halfway through. Damn, the end may seem near, but the road is still far ahead. I'll tell you that much. Honestly, if there was going to be a long episode, I'm glad it was this one, because I figured it's the least I can do to make up for the 3-month-long break since last episode. Sorry about that. Also, before we go, my previous video on Paul Zindel's raptor not only did pretty well, thank you all for that by the way, but there was a lot of love for the blackback's design especially. I ended up getting a lot of the art of it on my Discord server, and I loved all of these recreations so much that I wanted to share them with all of you. If any of you want to show me some of the art you've created as a result of my videos, join my Discord server, the Jurassic Junction, and show it to me there. Maybe I could start using these end segments of these videos to show off some of the art that you guys created as a result of my videos. And while I'm showing this art, I also want to mention that we've reached 45,000 subscribers, at least at the time that I'm recording this. For those of you that weren't there for it, back when I had 20,000 subscribers, I made a 50k subscriber goal, which was at the start of 2022, that I wanted to reach before the start of 2023. We're extremely close to that goal, and I have the perfect special planned for it when we do. Obviously, I'm not going to say what this special is yet, but my objective at this point is to try and reach it before the end of the year. So if you're not subscribed, but you like this kind of content, then join the cult. I mean join the channel for more stuff like this. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you all so much for watching, and please, have a nice day.